medium is the massage, is a teaser, a way of getting attention. The title is intended to draw attention to the fact that a medium is not something neutral. It does something to people. It takes hold of them, it roughs them up, it massages them, it bumps them around, and as it were, chiropractically.
Forgive my impertinence, but has anybody asked you why you are sometimes difficult to understand?
Because I use the right hemisphere when they're trying to use the left hemisphere.
Okay, well,
simple.
I'll try and get back on the line.
You see, when the people ordinarily people are trained to try to follow you and to connect everything you say with what they last heard. They're not prepared to use their wits. They're only prepared to use the idea they picked up the first time and try to connect it to another idea. So if you're in a situation that is flexible, where you have to use your wits and perceptions, they can't follow you. They have preconceptions that phase them out at once. You see, that's left hemisphere. I use the right hemisphere a great deal, which is a world of perception, no concepts. I don't use any.
Got you. And you don't try to connect things, you just let the right hemisphere take over and let it go.
And watch what's happening.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. Because I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me. Now, many people seem to think that if you talk about something recent, you're in favor of it. The exact opposite is true in my case. Anything I talk about is almost certainly to be something I'm resolutely against.
I read his work, and he really occupies a unique place in my mind because he's the only intellectual or artist or thinker who I've never been able to make up my mind about. In other words, I've never been able to decide whether McLuhan is the friend or the enemy.
And I think you probably could find in film schools and even in schools of English, people who have been influenced by him and who probably would now find it even embarrassing to say how much they'd been influenced by him. But nevertheless, if forced, if pushed, as you're doing now to me, would actually have to say that their eyes have been opened and their ears opened by the way in which McLuhan wrote.
I was incredibly vain in those years. I'm talking about the 60s, more or less. And I used to have the secret suspicion that I was as bright as anyone alive. And then when I met McLuhan, I said, no, my brain works at about 1/4 his speed. He had the fastest brain of anyone I've ever met.
I read only the right-hand page of serious books. If it's a frivolous, relaxing book, I read every word. But serious books, I read on the right-hand side only because I've discovered enormous redundancy in any well-written book. And I find that by reading only the right-hand page, this keeps me very wide awake, filling in the other page out of my own noodle.
He probably stimulated more people than almost anyone else around I could think of. Maybe he stimulated more people than anyone else around. But he tended to stimulate them like whirling dervishes. I used to be furious at him sometimes because I simply, you could read 2 or 3 chapters of him and boy, you'd have a fine time. Your mind would be going around and it'd be charged, but it wasn't always going anywhere because he confused as much as he elucidated.
I can't bear to reread anything I have ever written, or I couldn't bear to rehear anything I've ever said. That is, I might have to bear it, but it wouldn't be fun.
Is this man a genius or is he a bit of an intellectual charlatan?
McLuhan said, if you want to change your mind, change the medium. Change the words you use. Change the mode of communication. If you change the medium, you change yourself, you change your society.
I'm intrigued by the fact that you are from the South. And I've always had an interest in the South. My wife is from the South.
That's right, she's from Fort Worth.
From Fort Worth.
Yeah.
My name is Camille Paglia. I am Professor of Humanities at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and I'm the author of 2 books, Sexual Personae and Sex, Art, and American Culture. And I consider Marshall McLuhan one of the great masters of my college years.
Lewis, who did the prototype of the magazine and is behind the founding of it, thought of Marshall McLuhan as the person who most defined the culture that we were moving into. Though it seems that many people are talking about it, that he alone had some insights to it long ago before it was ever very real. And the first issue of the magazine, as well as the prototype, had quotes of Marshall McLuhan that seemed to us to have been written just yesterday. So he became the patron saint.
The global village is at once as wide as the planet and as small as a little town where everybody is maliciously engaged and poking his nose into everybody else's business.
There was a boldness in his vision that I think informs the magazine, and we're trying to take a little bit of his attitude.
My name is Tom Cooper. I'm now a professor at Emerson College in Boston, but I knew Marshall McLuhan during my graduate years when I was one of his graduate students and became an assistant also. He had several people around him working on projects. And I recall at the University of Toronto being part of that very exploratory group of individuals. It was like a think tank or an intellectual talk show where people gathered on a Monday or a Wednesday night and could hear anyone from Bucky Fuller to an advertising campaign manager being cross-examined or, if they were lucky, applauded by McLuhan. He was like the fastest gun in the West. People wanted to top his verbal repertoire, his wit, his turnaround of phrases, his verbal acrobatics, his command of literature, and so he loved a good sparring partner who could keep about a 90-mile-an-hour brain going up against his.
We ourselves are not clear what the role of a patron saint is for a magazine. I mean, most magazines don't have patron saints, but I think what a patron saint should do is sort of be a beacon lighting the way a little bit, and the way is not so much, the path is not exactly what's going to unfold, but maybe an attitude about the future. And I think that's probably more than anything else what McLuhan is we're trying to take a little bit of his attitude.
Sequel to Turn of the Screw?
It's the influence of television. Now, Marshall McLuhan deals with it in terms of it being a high intensity, you understand? A hot medium.
What I wouldn't give for a large sock with horse manure in it.
Which he uses essentially
What do you
linear.
do when you get stuck on a movie line with a guy like this behind you?
Wait a minute, why can't I give my opinion? It's a free country.
He can give you. Do you have to give it so loud? I mean, aren't you ashamed to pontificate like that? And the funny part of it is, Marshall McLuhan, you don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan's work.
Really? I happen to teach a class at Columbia called TV, Media, and Culture. So I think that my insights into Mr. McLuhan, well, have a great deal of validity.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Well, that's funny, because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So, yeah, just let me, come over here a second.
Oh,
Tell him.
I heard what you were saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
One of the big flips that's taking place in our time is the changeover from the eye to the ear. And most of us, having grown up in a visual world, are now suddenly confronted with the problems of living in an acoustic world, which is, in effect, a world of simultaneous information. So it's helpful to know the origins of the alphabet and of civilization and rationality in that sense, because we have come in the 20th century to the end of that road. And it's a considerable revolution to have been through 2,500 years of phonetic literacy, only to encounter the end of the road. One of the strange implications of the phonetic alphabet is private identity. Before phonetic literacy, there had been no private identity. There had only been the tribal group. Homer knows nothing about private identity. Homer's world of the acoustic epic, the tribal encyclopedia of memorized wisdom, which Eric Havelock has reported so ably in his preface to Plato. The Homeric epics were part of this acoustic wisdom that preceded literacy and which were phased out by literacy. Homer was wiped off by literacy. Homer had been the educational establishment of the Greeks for centuries. An educated Greek was one who had memorized Homer, who could sing it to his guitar or harp and perform it in public. He was a gentleman and a free man. Along came the phonetic alphabet, and it said, and Plato seized upon it and said, let us abandon Homer and go for rational education. Plato's war on the poets was not a war on poetry, but a war on the oral tradition of education. Now today, everyone in this room is being subjected to a new form of oral education. Literacy is still officially the educational establishment, but unofficially the oral forms are coming up very fast. This is the meaning of rock. It is a kind of education based upon an oral tradition, an acoustic experience which is quite strangely remote from literacy. Rock is a kind of central oral form of education which threatens the whole educational establishment. If Homer was wiped out by literacy, literacy can be wiped out by rock. We're playing the old story backwards, but you should know what the stakes are. The stakes are our civilization and versus tribalism and groupism, private identity versus corporate identity, and private responsibility versus the group or tribal mandate.
Rock and roll, to me, the great art form of the end of the century, still has never gained the respect that it deserves from critics. I mean, there are people who are rock fans and who've written serious books about it, but people who are untouched by rock music have absolutely no respect for it. So there's a lot of work to do here at the end of the century, following in the McLuhan line.
The movie medium is hot and loves violent events, just as the newspaper is hot and loves violent events. But the TV medium is so involving in the process of whatever's going on that it is cool.
Film was a hot medium because the amount of clarity and crispness of an image is greater for film than it is for video. The clarity and the resolution of the image of film is very high. It's not as high as the human eye, but it's very high. And because of the way in which film is presented, wide screen, enveloping, sort of this immersion principle where you feel that you're inside the movie, that tends to make film a hot medium so that people engage with it in a different way. Television is a cool medium because the resolution of a television image, the sharpness of it, is lower. TV, no matter how sharp it is still very fuzzy compared to film, and there's nowhere near as much color information in video as there is in film. So that when people look at video, a funny thing happens. They have to add something to the image in order to engage with it. And that's an unconscious process of adding. And it's added, the thing that's added is added from the imagination. And it produces a kind of a meshing with the video image, where you're not only watching it, but you're also, to a certain extent, co-creating it in your mind, in your imagination. Because what people try to do, it seems, when they watch images, is to try to create them in a particular kind of reality, a kind of an imaginary reality that has a certain clarity to it that the image itself doesn't have.
Cool is involving, hot is not.
Phone sex is a very cool medium. It's cool because you only have one sensory modality going. You have the modality of voice. And using voice, people create very detailed images of each other's bodies, to the extent that you have a great deal of erotic involvement, which is, of course, the goal of a lot of the kinds of media work that we do, is to get erotic involvement in a kind of a viewer's satisfaction, emotional and physical satisfaction on the part of the person who's watching. But with phone sex, you do it by boiling down your descriptions of activities and of bodies into very small tokens, and then you squirt them down a phone line, and the person at the other end adds boiling water and reconstructs a very detailed image of what's going on. But that process of reconstructing the image is done in the person's mind, and they do it by adding their own ideas of what the token contains. And that's the way that cool images work. It requires you to add your own idea of what's going on, which is why cool images, in a way, are more engaging than hot images and provide more opportunities for the viewer to engage and produce ultimately a more real, more detailed, more complex world of engagement, so-called diegetic space, than you can with the images that are hotter, which tend to present their own versions of what's going on to you.
Even though McLuhan's books are long lost and no longer read, still one of his most famous terms is that polarity between hot and cold, by which he analyzed the television, and it was used by the American media to explain why John Kennedy did so well in the first debate that he had with Richard Nixon. That the people say that those who happened to listen to that debate on the radio felt that Nixon had won the debate. Those who watched it on television thought that Kennedy had resoundingly defeated Nixon. So what McLuhan began to see is that style is substance in many ways in modern times.
The characters who had arranged that debate and scripted every aspect of it had no understanding of TV. And they didn't even know that TV is not a debating medium. And they had arranged it as if it were a newspaper setup or a radio setup. They had no awareness of TV.
We're not in a time now where we can have long 3.5-hour debates. There's no way that any presidential candidate can ever be fully prepared for the kind of crises that face a world leader today. That in point of fact, the soundbite or the TV camera coming up into your face, that can tell you far more about a man or a woman's reflexes, a man or a woman's character under pressure.
If this debate had been arranged by people who, in your view, knew and understood television, how would it have been done?
Well, now, this would take quite a while to explain, but it would be much closer to what we're doing right here. Chatting casually, spontaneously, without a script, and paying attention to what is being said. What those men said last night was merely to hold the audience on the image. It didn't matter at all what was said last night. The image was what mattered, and as anything that could hold the attention on the image was all that mattered, from the point of view of the arrangers.
Well, you are the proponent, of course, that television is a cool medium.
Yes.
Both candidates last night were programmed and costumed and made up precisely.
Had either candidate dared to present a policy, it would have destroyed his image.
Was one more cool than the other from a purely television point of view?
No, they're both in a state of panic cool. They were terrified of making a false step. And they're quite rightly so.
Why shouldn't they be terrified? After all, why shouldn't they have all of these conditions on television debate when they're running for the highest office and they want to control the environment?
With the breakdown in the mechanism, there was the wonderful revelation of all the characters who had scripted the show. They came out into the open like something out of the woodwork and revealed that a stupid show had been put together very carefully, and by people who had no idea of what the TV medium is about.
Would you argue, Professor McLuhan, that the candidates would be better off not to debate than to debate in the manner in which they did?
Of course.
The candidates...
They were standing in press-the-pants barrels, looking absolutely like some straight-jacketed characters, absolutely the hottest type of medium you could imagine. Everything that the scripters and arrangers had done was hot stuff. They had no idea of what the TV medium is made of.
Apropos of McLuhan's political views, it is important to remember that above and foremost, McLuhan was a satirist. He used to say, all my work is satire, and read in a certain way, it appears fairly evident. He used to make fun of politicians and fun of business people, and far from pandering to the powers that be, I think that he always kept a very safe distance from them. And perhaps the most important thing about McLuhan, besides the satire, is freedom. The freedom of any kind of bind or tie to a cause, a party, or any particular type of things that would turn him into a fundamentalist of any kind.
I feel that that television, far from, as Postman says, causing the death of politics, is the way that we will avoid Hitler. Hitler could not have survived. That small, absurd man with a mustache, right, could not have risen, I believe, to national power in Germany with the television cameras following him around. He would look too absurd.
Hitler was entirely a radio man and a tribal man.
And what does television do then to that tribal man?
Well, I don't think Hitler would have lasted long on TV. Like Senator Joe McCarthy, he would have looked foolish. He was a very hot character, and like Nixon. Made a very bad image on television. He was far too hot a character. Much better on radio or on the movies. Not bad on the movies, which will take quite hot characters. But Nixon was hopeless on TV.
And certainly, I think, it's one of the reasons why the Klan, despite the Ku Klux Klan continuing to arise in spots all around the country, the Klan continually looks ridiculous. No one has to say anything. All you have to do is take these cameras into a Klan office, or take the cameras into a skinhead or a neo-fascist organization, have them talk. And when the camera's up in their face, right, there's nothing charismatic about these people. They look as if they're very confused, desperate, and people without any deep policies.
When you live out on the frontier, you have no identity. You're a nobody. Therefore, you get very tough. You have to prove that you are somebody. And so you become very violent. And so identity is always accompanied by violence. This it seems paradoxical to you, that ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. So it's only the threat to people's identity that makes them violence. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get notice.
It is television, okay, that has made Perot, for example, but it also destroyed Perot. All right? The television coming up close has in fact reduced Perot's, I think, ultimate electability. Perot's ideas without the television camera would have been far more potent, I think. The television camera coming up close just showed his slipperiness, showed that he is a wonderful outside critic of establishment excesses, but that this is not someone you want to trust in the White House.
If you turned in a paper to McLuhan for grading, there weren't 100 million comments that were frivolous, dotting I's and so forth, although I enjoy that kind of teaching. But instead it would come back with a little pencil mark in the upper right-hand corner saying 3 new ideas, or 2 ideas, or 1 idea. He was concerned with how much thinking you'd actually done. He often flaunted his students into seeing their own pedantry or their own conventional wisdom.
He was a professor, a very learned man who suddenly was caught in the public spotlight, and then was seen everywhere. Suddenly he was in this magazine and that magazine. He was taken up by journalists. People would call him up and ask him questions on all kinds of topics, from the simple to the abstruse and so on. And we haven't had anyone like that before me, since McLuhan. It's odd.
There was this great phenomena called the Monday night seminar that many individuals were gravitated to. It was like a magnet. Sometimes there was heated debate. Other times McLuhan would give the person enough rope to hang themselves, and then he'd encircle their perspective. Other times there would be this enormous confusion on the part of students, and Marshall would have to spend an entire hour just letting them know what the perspective on knowledge should be. And it varied from week to week. As he did that, his genius appeared to be his ability to win us over, some by degrees, others immediately, to having not only a larger perspective, but a greater passion for the pursuit of truth. He may not have given us truth, but he gave us a greater passion for the urge to reveal it and find it.
McLuhan was creating the persona of the scholar who is also the cultural commentator, who reconciles in his own mind, his own person, the terrible divisions that we have between high culture and popular culture that we still suffer from, despite everything that Andy Warhol and Klaus Oldenburg, the great pop artist, did. We still have a terrible gap. I want a whole new curriculum, and I want the students in the classroom in the 90s to be much more skeptical about what they're getting, okay? If the teacher in a, say, cultural studies course about media, okay, is giving them moralistic terms that make them superior to media, using words like commodification, okay, or sexual objectification about women, or if you get getting a kind of a moral tone and a kind of condemning tone about media, you can be sure your teacher doesn't know, has his or her ass from his or her elbow, okay? Because I just absolutely loathe the importation of moralistic terms from the Judeo-Christian realm into the pagan realm of mass media. Mass media are completely amoral. It's completely immoral, okay? And if you're going to use terms, you're going to have to use them from the history of paganism, not from the history of Judeo-Christianity.
Some of his perceptions are absolutely startling and remarkable. I mean, the medium is the message. It's one of the most useful remarks, I think, that have been uttered in the 20th century.
We now live in a situation where the medium does not just convey information to us, but that the medium itself, by its very existence, makes us over, changes us, creates us as new kinds of beings. not only in terms of new citizens, but actually new kinds of creatures that think differently. And that kind of thought, the very structure of our thinking, of our perceiving of the world, and of our interacting with each other, is conditioned by the existence of the medium itself. So that in essence, it doesn't matter what you send through those wires, we're still going to change. And that change will be just as profound, no matter what comes through the wires.
Then came Marshall McLuhan in the 1950s. McLuhan said, in the Socratic sense, the medium is the message. The words you use, the modes of communication you use, determine the realities you inhabit. Most of our lives, most of us live in realities determined by others, imprinted in our brains by education, by religion, by politics, by the authorities. McLuhan said, if you want to change your mind, change the medium, change the words you use, change the mode of communication. If you change the medium, you change yourself, you change your society.
Simplest terms, I felt that what McLuhan meant when he said that the medium is the message is that content is irrelevant. Now that is just anathema to anybody in broadcast journalism, because necessarily we must concentrate on content, so that to us it wasn't the medium that was the message, but it was the content that is the message. Or, in McLuhan's terms, it's the message that is the message. It was meant to remind us of something we all need to be reminded of, that our job is not done if we want to understand how clearly we are coming across. And we must have some understanding of what the transmitting medium does to our messages and what that does to the recipient of the messages.
I have been asked what is a McLuhanism by people from time to time, and once I remembered an item that came to my rescue. There's a sign hanging on a Toronto junkyard which reads, "Help beautify junkyards. Throw something lovely away today." And this kind of bizarre, would-be cynical and paradoxical sort of remark has, I think, some of the characteristics of a McLuhanism, which consists perhaps simply in tying in unexpected circuit things that don't ordinarily get off a single line or a single plane. It's a form of circuitry.
You know, the one-liner is for people of very short attention span. They won't stay around for you to tell them a story. You have to work fast. You flip in with a single gag in one era and out another. And this is where it's at. Now, there's this one-liner about Zeus, who says to his fellow god, Narcissus, "Watch yourself."
He would make a metaphor, whether there was need for it or not, whether it's suited, not necessarily the facts, but one's intuition about the facts or not, and that he was a compulsive creator of metaphors.
At the time I was working on my article about McLuhan, I was also supposed to do one on the topless restaurants of San Francisco. So I got the bright idea of taking McLuhan to a topless restaurant called the Off-Broadway. I remember we went there with the columnist Herb Caen and Howard Gossage, who was an advertising man who invented the Beethoven sweatshirt, among other things. Inside, we found ourselves in a cave full of businessmen in gray sack suits, attended by about 24 waitresses who were naked except for G-strings and spike-heel shoes. And Caen and Gossage and I were speechless, but not McLuhan. He immediately said, "Why, they're not undressed at all." And I said, "They're not?" And he said, "Of course not. They're wearing us." McLuhan graduated from the University of Manitoba in 1932 with a BA and an MA and won a scholarship to Cambridge, where he eventually earned a second BA, a second MA, and a PhD. The 1930s were a time of feverish intellectual novelty in England. Young literary souls began to dote on the lower classes, some as socialists, but others merely as enthusiasts of pop cult, of movies, advertising, radio, which Wyndham Lewis was calling a new language. McLuhan was also influenced by the fashionable British Catholic intellectuals, G.K. Chesterton, Hilary Belloc, Gerald Manley Hopkins. And like his contemporary, Evelyn Waugh, who was an Oxford man, McLuhan became a convert to Catholicism. In the summer of 1939, McLuhan met a drama student from Texas named Corinne Lewis at the Pasadena Playhouse in California. He'd gone there to visit his mother, who was teaching drama. He stayed to court Corinne.
There was Marshall, 6'2", very, very thin, with a little mustache, and very self-contained, and very British, with this peculiar Canadian accent. I thought he was the strangest duck I had ever met. The only person who absolutely knew his mind and was uncompromising about his beliefs. There wasn't any bending at the middle or adjusting or manipulating. And as he said to me, he was going to Cambridge anyway, and he wanted to get married and wanted me to go with him. And I said, oh, well, I was having such a good time at home. I said, well, we'll correspond, and then I'll see you next summer when you come back. No, either I would go with him or forget all about it. Well, I wasn't used to such treatment. I wondered what made this man tick. Ended up marrying Marshall and telegraphing my family afterwards. We landed in London the night before war was declared, and then went on down to Cambridge. And we spent the whole first year of the war, 39 to 40, in Cambridge. And that first year we lived quite close to the camp. Marshall loved punting and rowing, and very often we'd go down and he'd row. He was completely different from anyone I'd ever known. His reactions were different. He was more self-contained. I used to have to prod him to get compliments out of him. They embarrassed him. His head was working 24 hours a day. Often he'd get up in the middle of the night and scribble down something or read. It wasn't a choice. He just couldn't help it. He was intellectually driven. And so he was always so sure of what he was and who he was. Never any doubts. And he was a very, very religious man. And as a matter of fact, that's, I think, the only thing that helped him through the 15 months after his stroke. But that was at the core of his being, this religious strength.
Marshall and Corinne McLuhan had 6 children: Eric, the twins Mary and Terry, Stephanie, Elizabeth, and Michael. Here we see McLuhan engaging in a flurry of fatherhood for some home movie cameras in the late 1940s. But in fact, he often worked at a ping-pong table in the backyard to escape the crowd inside the house.
He was a family man in that he liked the idea of being a family man. But he was so nervously organized that he couldn't stand the chaos of children.
McLuhan's monomania could make him a hard ticket for friendship and at times for fatherhood, as in this scene, in which he tries to theorize on the subject in the presence of his daughter Mary just before her wedding, then feels the fog of intellectual fatuity rolling in and shuts up.
Fatherhood is a rather unusual idea. People seem to talk much more about motherhood. There's such a huge gap between the events that go to the making up of fatherhood that it seems an unreal topic, doesn't it? It is. It's a very brief sort of topic, isn't it, compared to motherhood, which extends outward for great periods. No, fatherhood is a very abrupt, aphoristic matter. It's just an aside.
His senses were so high-pitched. He had about at least 200% hearing. And his sight was remarkable. He could read signs when I couldn't even see that there was a sign ahead. But all of his senses were keyed up, were high-pitched, which made it a little difficult to be the ordinary, complacent, genial family man that the term implies.
But we found that every night he would come and say, make great strides today, make great discoveries today. I did this and I did that. And he'd talk about some sort of obscure piece of information that you'd have absolutely no interest in. And that had a resultant kind of effect that, first of all, you rarely communicated anything to him. You generally talked to my mother. And second of all, you were sort of weaned and fed on McLuhanisms from the time you were quite young. So everything that everybody else found profound, you found quite commonplace.
From 1937 on, McLuhan taught at Catholic institutions, most notably St. Michael's College of the University of Toronto, home of a little cottage that sagged under the weight of the name McLuhan had given it, the Center for Culture and Technology.
Being a Catholic made him conscious of the fact that he was a creature, and there was a creator, and there was a world scene. There was a human condition, and he was addressing himself to thinking about the human condition and trying to see the way that developments in society and things like that, technological changes, were affecting the human condition, not only locally, but on a global scale. And of course, he would never think of missing Mass or anything like that. And people who would come to his office would, you know, be engaged in a conversation. The 12 o'clock Angelus would ring, and Marshall said, well, I'm going to Mass. Do you want to come with me? So it was a deep part of his personality.
Marshall, in my dealings with him over many years, kept his Catholicism separate in that way. He did not use a lot of theological scripture, for example, to substantiate his academic arguments. He did not appeal to religious nomenclature, for the most part, in an academic lesson. He sought to keep the two separate in a professional way, and also in a way that would keep him from experiencing cognitive dissonance, because in the one quadrant of his brain there were many elements that he accepted on faith, but in the other quadrant there were elements that he invited us to use skillful scholarly scrutiny to underpin their assumptions, and the two frequently don't mix.
The global village is at once as wide as the planet and as small as a little town where everybody is maliciously engaged and poking his nose into everybody else's business.
It is interesting, for example, that the global village was, as McLuhan put it, Humpty Dumpty put together again, where the alphabet had been explosive, turning a society fairly unified in its single ideology, that of the Christian domain, into individuals who all were making up their own minds and creating their own inner consciousness as they were reading and writing, working out their thoughts. Suddenly this electronic environment was making of everybody, once again, a kind of a huge community.
The effect of that is that the world becomes as small as the box on your desk, and nobody is any further away than a telephone or than a computer or than a video screen. And that creates a different way of thinking about the world. The world becomes a very small, intimate kind of place. And McLuhan saw I think, both the good and the bad sides of that. The good side being that it creates a sense of intimacy. It creates a sense that everything is everywhere all at once and it's all right here, which is a collapse of space and time. But there was also the bad side of it, and the bad side of it was that everything that goes on in the village square becomes of the same general magnitude. So that if you look out the door of your electronic hut and you see somebody fighting in the village square, it's a fight in the village square, and it's in your lap, whether it's two people who are sort of poking at each other or complaining to each other or nuking each other. It's still all going on in your front yard.
Now, McLuhan never claimed that in the global village there would be peace. On the contrary, he said nothing could be more fierce than the rivalries and the complexities of the relationship between the villagers. The villagers are imploding on each other. They are busy in exploring and spying on each other's business. And in fact, whereas in the old days of print, because of the space of the world, which was an expansive space, you might see a dozen persons a day. Thanks to television, thanks to radio, thanks to the network, you would be in touch with, either directly and really or indirectly, you would be in touch with several hundred people a day. That is part of the implosive quality of the electronic environment of the global village.
What would happen if you could shut off television for 30 days in the entire United States of America?
It would be a kind of hangover effect, because it's a very addictive medium. And you take it away and people develop all the symptoms of a hangover. Two or 3 years ago, they actually paid people not to watch TV for a few months.
I don't recall that, but I'm sure
it was in Germany. It was in Germany. It was in the UK, and they discovered they had all the withdrawal symptoms of drug addicts.
The medium is totally participant, uses the eye as an ear, not as an eye. Television is not a visual medium. It's an acoustic medium, and hence the participation is like music, not like vision. Vision is detached. You stand back and watch, but you don't stand back and watch television. You're in it.
The thought just occurred to me that possibly if you turned off television, there would be a lot of people who would